In the autumn of 1886, in the high country of the Wyoming Territory, the people of Split Creek watched a widow do something that made no sense. She was planting sunflowers, not in a garden, not along a fence. She was planting them in a ring around her own cabin, tied against the timber walls, as if flowers could turn back a Wyoming winter. Everyone who saw it thought the same thing. The cold didn't care about decoration. The cold didn't negotiate with anything that bloomed. They were wrong. 6 weeks later, a storm without mercy came down off the divide and buried that valley under 8 feet of snow and a temperature that broke thermometers. Cabins with stone foundations and good stoves failed that week. Men who had wintered in that valley for 20 years lost livestock, lost fingers, lost hope. And through the worst of it, one small cabin, ringed by dead, brown, broken-down sunflower stalks, stayed warm enough for a woman to hang laundry indoors. The men who rode past her fence that autumn didn't slow their horses to be polite about it. They slowed to stare, the way you'd stare at a house on fire or a grave being dug too early. A widow, alone but for a boy and a dog, spending her last good weeks of daylight not on firewood, not on hay, but on flowers already dead in the field. It looked, to every eye in that valley, like grief finally catching up to her mind. Would that fragile ring of dried weeds turn out to be a joke the valley told on itself, or the only thing standing between a family and the grave? Subscribe now, because before this story ends, you're going to understand exactly why a dying flower can outlast a dying man. Let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Mara Voss, and by the time the first frost came that year, she had already buried her husband in ground too hard to dig twice. Daniel Voss had died 2 winters before, in a cabin with gaps between the logs you could see lamplight through. He hadn't died of a fever. He hadn't died of an accident. He had simply gotten too cold, one long January night, and never gotten warm again. Mara had held his hands until they stopped shaking, and then she had stopped shaking herself, not from cold, but from something colder. She swore that night that she would never again watch someone she loved go still from something as ordinary as a draft. So when the harvest came in that September, and the other women of Split Creek were putting up preserves, Mara Voss was hauling wheelbarrows of dead sunflower stalks, 8 feet tall, thick as a man's wrist at the base, hollow-boned and dry, and stacking them against every outer wall of her cabin like she was building a second house made of nothing. The town noticed. The town always notices. Otis Kell saw her first, from the road, and laughed so hard he had to sit down on his wagon seat. Widow Voss has gone and planted herself a garden of ghosts, he said, and by supper that night, half of Split Creek was calling it exactly that, the weed wall. Some said it kinder. Most didn't. Children were told not to laugh at Widow Voss to her face, and most of them laughed behind their hands instead, which was worse. At the Mercantile that Saturday, a woman named Corinne Pruitt, Gideon's wife, a woman with a sharp tongue and a sharper memory for other people's failures, said loud enough for the whole store to hear that grief did strange things to a woman's sense. First, she loses Daniel to the cold, Corinne said, and now she means to fight it with flowers. God help that boy. A few women laughed along with her. A few didn't, but none of them spoke up either. Silence, that day, belonged to everyone but Mara. Mara said nothing. She kept hauling stalks. Silence in that valley had always been mistaken for surrender. It never was. She had buried her husband in that ground. She had learned, in the 2 winters since, exactly how little other people's opinions weighed against a child's warm hands in the morning. Her son, Tam, 7 years old and quiet like his mother, asked her once why she didn't just chink the log gaps with more mud like everyone else did. Mara knelt down in the yard, a bundle of stalks across her shoulder, and said the only thing she ever said about it in public. Mud freezes, Tam. Mud cracks. This won't. That was all. She went back to work. But that night, after Tam was asleep, Mara sat by the stove and thought about her grandfather, a man named Ezra Voss, who had crossed from Nebraska in a sod wagon 30 years before anyone else thought to try it, and who had built sod houses that stayed warm through winters that killed cattle standing up in the fields. Ezra had died when Mara was 14, but she had spent 3 winters at his side, packing turned prairie sod into walls 2 feet thick, and she remembered exactly what he used to say while he worked, his breath fogging in the cold, his hands never stopping. Cold ain't the thing killing men, he'd tell her. Moving air is. He said it so many times, it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like scripture. A house didn't need to be warm, Ezra taught her. A house needed to trap the air already inside it and refuse to let it leave. Dead, still, unmoving air, layered thick enough that the cold outside and the warmth inside never had to touch. Sod worked because sod was thick and full of trapped air. Stalks work the same way, he told her once. If you pack them right, hollow, dry, bundled close, layered like feathers on a bird. A dead wall rots, he used to say. A breathing wall survives. She hadn't understood that line as a girl. She understood it now, watching her own breath in the cold cabin where her husband had died. She remembered one particular night, deep in her 15th winter, when a Nebraska blow had come through hard enough to rattle the shutters, and she had asked Ezra, half frightened, whether the sod walls would hold. He hadn't looked up from the harness he was mending. "Wind's not trying to get through the wall, girl," he told her. "Wind's trying to get through you. Every gap you leave is a door you built for it yourself." She had never forgotten the way he said it, not as a warning, but as a plain fact. The way another man might tell you water runs downhill. It was, she came to understand years later, the whole of what he'd ever tried to teach her about surviving a winter. That the cold was patient and indifferent and would take every door you left open for it. And no more. Sunflowers weren't sod, and Mara knew it. But the stalks, cut in September, while they were still full of pith and hollow, chambered through the stem, dried into something close enough. Light, fibrous, riddled with tiny air pockets no wind could easily push through if they were packed tight and layered right. She had tested a single bundle of them that spring, half out of curiosity and half out of desperation, holding a candle flame an inch from a packed sample in a stiff wind and watching it barely bend. That was the morning she decided the flowers weren't foolishness. They were an inheritance, finally coming due. That was where the idea had come from. Not madness, not grief alone, but a 14-year-old girl's memory of an old man's hands, packing sod against a Nebraska wind, saying the same 3 or 4 sentences over and over until they became the only inheritance he had to leave her. Not everyone in Split Creek was cruel about it. Hollis Dunmore, the valley's most respected builder, the man who had framed half the barns and every church pew for 30 miles, rode out to see it for himself before he'd say a word either way. Hollis wasn't a mocking man. He was a careful one, and careful men worried Mara more than loud ones. He walked the perimeter of her cabin slowly, running a thumb along the stacked stalks, testing their give. Moisture will rot this by December, he told her finally. Mice will nest in it by January. And dry as this stuff is, one spark off your chimney and the whole wall goes up like kindling. He wasn't wrong to worry about any of it. Rot was real. Mice were real. Fire was real. He wasn't a man inventing objections to feel important. He was a man who had watched too many good ideas fail in this valley for reasons nobody thought to test beforehand. You're not wrong about any of that, Hollis, Mara said. I've thought on all three. Then, convince me, he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. I can't yet, she told him. Come back in December. He looked at her a long moment, the way a man looks at a bridge he isn't sure will hold his weight. And then he tipped his hat and rode off, without another word. He didn't laugh. He didn't scold. He simply reserved judgment, which from Hollis Dunmore was almost a kindness. That night, at the Mercantile, Otis Kell asked Hollis straight out whether the weed wall was as foolish as it looked. Hollis took his time answering, the way he always did. Foolish? I don't know, he said finally. Wrong, maybe. She's got rot coming, and mice, and a fire risk besides. Unless she's smarter about it than any builder I've met in this valley. But I've been wrong about women's ideas before, and I mean to watch this one all the way through before I say which it is. It wasn't an endorsement. It wasn't mockery either. In a town already half decided against her, it was the only fair hearing Mara Voss was going to get. And it came from the one man whose opinion the whole valley trusted enough to change its mind later. By August, while the sunflowers were still standing tall and gold across 3 acres she'd planted the spring before, planted for this purpose alone, though she'd told no one that at the time, Mara had already begun cutting the earliest ones, the ones whose stalks had gone from green to a deep straw brown, thick and dry enough to hold their shape. She cut low, near the root, and stacked the stalks in loose bundles under the eaves of a barn to cure further, out of the rain, out of the frost that would come too early for the rest. By October, the real work had begun, and it was slower and harder than anyone watching from the road understood. Mara wasn't just leaning stalks against her walls. She was building. First came the frame, a second wall of split cedar posts driven into the ground 22 inches out from her cabin's log walls, running the full circuit of the building. Between that outer frame and her actual walls, she began packing the sunflower stalks in bundled courses, each course laid horizontal like cordwood, each bundle tied at both ends with strips of rawhide so it wouldn't slump or shift. She packed the wall 32 inches thick at the base, tapering to 24 at the eaves, and she left a 2-inch air gap between the stalk wall and the log wall itself. A dead space, unmoving, that Ezra had taught her mattered as much as the stalks did. Her palms split open in the first week. She wrapped them in rags and kept working. Her hands bled through 3 pairs of gloves before November. She counted every wheelbarrow load out loud to Tam in the evenings, the way other mothers might count sheep, 40 loads, 60 loads, 90 loads, because counting was easier than admitting how tired she was. The real secret, the thing Ezra had never fully explained, but she understood now with her hands raw from proving it, was that the stalks themselves weren't the wall. The stalks were a trap. Every hollow stem, every gap between bundles, held a pocket of still air, and still air did not carry heat away the way moving air did. Wind was the enemy, not cold. Cold was only dangerous when it was allowed to move through a house and steal the warmth out of it. one draft at a time, the way it had stolen the warmth out of Daniel. One long night, one small gap in the logs at a time. Pull, pack, tie. That was the rhythm of 6 straight weeks. Pull a bundle from the wagon, pack it into its course, snug against its neighbors. Tie it off before it could shift. Pull, pack, tie. She worked from first light until her hands stopped obeying her, ate her dinner cold more nights than not, and fell asleep some evenings still wearing her work gloves, too tired to peel them off. Tam helped where a 7-year-old could, hauling the shorter bundles, holding court taut while his mother tied it, fetching water when her throat went dry from the dust the dried stalks threw into the air. He asked her once, kneeling beside her in the cold dirt, whether the flowers would really stop the winter from getting in. Mara sat back on her heels and thought about it before she answered, the way she thought about everything now. Nothing stops winter, Tam, she said. Winter comes, whether we're ready or not. All we can do is give it nowhere to get in. It was the closest she ever came, that whole autumn, to saying out loud what she believed. Tam nodded, like it made perfect sense, the way children often understand the plain truth of a thing faster than adults do, and went back to hauling stalks. By the 3rd week of October, half the cabin wore its new skin. By the 2nd week of November, all of it did, and from the road it looked exactly like what the town had named it. A dead garden, stacked 8 feet high, gone brown and brittle in the frost. The failure came in the last week of November, and it nearly undid all of it. Mara woke one morning to a smell she recognized instantly and hated. The sour, wet smell of rot. On the north wall, the side that never saw sun, a 2-foot section of stalks had gone soft and dark, condensation trapped between the outer bark and the frozen air beyond it. Moisture, with nowhere to go. Hollis's warning, come true exactly as he'd predicted, on exactly the wall he'd predicted it on, the shaded, wind-blocked north face, where damp air could gather and never dry. She could have panicked. She didn't. She tore the rotten section out with her bare hands, cursing the cold that split her knuckles further, and studied the wall the way Ezra had taught her to study a failed sword course, not with despair, but with a question. Why here? Why this wall? The answer came within the hour. She had packed the north side too tight, with no venting at all, sealing moisture in with nowhere to escape. Every other wall breathed a little, at the seams. This one didn't. So she rebuilt it. Not the same way, but better. She left narrow reed-lined gaps at the base of every third course on the shaded wall, just wide enough to let trapped moisture bleed out slowly without letting the wind in. A breathing wall survives, her grandfather used to say, and now she understood that even a wall of trapped air needed somewhere small to exhale. It took her 4 more days to rebuild what had taken a day and a half to fail. When she finished, the north wall was the strongest one on the cabin. It had to be. It had already lost once, and she had made certain it would not lose twice. By the 1st week of December, the wall was finished, whole, and waiting. Tam noticed the change before the adults did. He'd taken to sleeping some nights with the family's dog, a rangy grey shepherd mix named Rook, curled against the base of the north wall, the coldest spot in any ordinary cabin, and now, strangely, one of the warmest in this one. But 3 nights into December, Rook wouldn't settle there at all. He paced instead. He whined at the door and refused his supper. He'd sit at the window and stare north with his ears pinned flat, the way he used to when wolves came down close to the fence line. Except there were no wolves that week. There was nothing at all. That was the trouble. The geese that usually lingered on the creek until Christmas were gone by the second week of December, every last one of them, in a single grey morning, flying south in a silence nobody could quite explain. Old Amos Ferry, a trapper who'd wintered in that country longer than anyone living, rode into Split Creek on the 14th and told anyone who'd listen that he'd never in 40 years seen the sky go that particular shade of white this early. "Air's dead still," he said, standing in the middle of the road, turning his face up like he was listening for something. "Been 30 years since I felt it go this still before a blow. Don't like it. Don't like it one bit." Nobody laughed at Amos. Nobody ever laughed at Amos. That night, the wind that had rattled every loose shutter in the valley for a month simply stopped. Not calmed, stopped entirely, as though the whole territory had drawn one long breath and was holding it. Mara stood in her yard in that terrible quiet and felt something in her chest go tight and small. Rook wouldn't come when she called him. He stood at the edge of the sunflower wall, staring north, and refused to move. It came on the 17th of December, and men in Split Creek would call it the Iron Silent Storm for the rest of their lives, named not for its sound, which was a roar, but for the dead quiet that came before it, the held breath the whole valley had felt and dreaded and been unable to name. The temperature dropped from 18 degrees to 19 below zero in under 6 hours. By midnight it was 40 degrees below, and the wind that had been absent for 2 days returned all at once, 60 miles an hour, driving snow sideways hard enough to strip bark from young trees. Nature had arrived, and nature never negotiated its verdicts. 3 cabins on the far side of Split Creek lost their roofs before morning. A rancher named Gideon Pruitt lost 11 head of cattle to the cold in a single night. Animals frozen standing in a windbreak that hadn't broken enough wind. Corinne Pruitt, the same woman who had laughed at the mercantile in September, spent that night wrapped in every blanket her family owned, feeding the stove until the woodpile ran dangerously low, watching frost creep across the inside of her own window panes despite the fire roaring 6 feet away. The storm did not care who had prepared and who had not. It only asked the one question it always asked. Could the wind get in? For most of the valley, the answer was yes, and the storm walked in through every crack and answered it. Inside the Voss cabin, the wall held for 11 hours. Then, sometime past midnight, with the wind screaming loud enough to swallow every other sound in the world, a section of the wall's outer frame tore loose on the northwest corner, the one place the wind hit hardest and longest, and a 6-foot gap opened straight through to the log wall beneath. Mara felt the draft before she saw it, a thin, cold finger of moving air crawling across the cabin floor. The exact kind of moving air that had killed Daniel 2 winters before. And she was on her feet and into her coat before she'd fully decided to move at all. Tam screamed for her not to go. Rook threw himself against the door, barking into the dark like he could bark the storm back. Mara tied a rope from her waist to the door handle, the only tether she had, the only thing standing between going out and never coming back, and stepped into a whiteout so complete she couldn't see her own boots. She found the torn section by feel alone, her bare hands already going numb inside frozen gloves, the wind trying to peel her off the wall the way it had already peeled the frame loose. She repacked the fallen bundles with fingers she could no longer feel, retying rawhide cord with her teeth when her hands stopped answering her, working by the one rule Ezra had drilled into her 100 times over. Pull, pack, tie. Pull, pack, tie, until the gap closed and the draft died. and the wall breathed shut again, like a wound sealing over, twice. In those 11 minutes, the wind knocked her flat against the wall she was trying to save, the breath driven clean out of her, snow packing into her collar and her sleeves until she couldn't tell anymore which parts of her were cold and which had simply stopped feeling anything at all. Once, the rope at her waist went taut and nearly wrenched her off her feet entirely, and she understood, in the one clear thought she had time for, that if the rope broke or the knot slipped, no one would find her before morning, if they found her at all. She thought of Daniel. She thought of the gap in the logs that had killed him. She did not let go of the wall. She made it back inside, on her hands and knees, half frozen, and Tam and Rook both threw themselves against her at once, one crying, one whining, both refusing to let go. She had been outside 11 minutes. It felt, she would say later, like the longest 11 minutes of her life, longer than the night she'd buried Daniel, because this time there had still been something left to save. She sat by the stove afterward, with Tam pressed against one side and Rook against the other, her hands wrapped in warm cloth, feeling slowly returning to her fingers in small, aching waves. And she said her grandfather's words out loud to no one in particular, the way another woman might have said a prayer. A dead wall rots. A breathing wall survives. Outside, the iron silent storm went on tearing at the valley for 2 more days, indifferent to whether it had won or lost inside that one small cabin. It would not know the answer until the wind finally let go. The storm raged for 2 more days. When it finally broke on the morning of the 19th, Split Creek looked like a different valley. Snow drifted to rooflines, fence posts buried entirely, smoke rising crooked and thin from chimneys where fires had nearly failed. Hollis Dunmore came by sled 2 days after the roads cleared, half expecting, he admitted later, to find the Voss cabin buried and silent. Instead, he found Mara Voss hanging laundry indoors, steam rising off wet wool in a cabin warm enough that Tam was running around in his shirt sleeves. Hollis didn't say anything at first. He walked outside instead, to where Mara had hung 2 thermometers, one nailed to a fence post in the open yard, one mounted just inside the gap between the stalk wall and the log wall, the dead air pocket her grandfather had taught her to trust. He crouched and read them both without a word. The outer thermometer read 38 degrees below zero. The inner one, nestled in that breathing wall of dead sunflower stalks, read 61 degrees above. A difference of 99 degrees, separated by 32 inches of dead flowers and a 2-inch pocket of still air, and nothing else at all. Hollis read the 2 numbers 3 times, as if repetition might change one of them. It didn't. Mara had kept a ledger too, through the whole of the storm. Hours, temperatures, the wood she'd burned, the wood she still had left in the stack. It showed a family that had used less than half the cordwood Hollis's own well-built barn had burned through in the same 3 days, for a cabin that had stayed nearly 40 degrees warmer throughout. The numbers required no interpretation. Hollis pressed his bare palm flat against the log wall from inside the cabin. Warm, dry, no trace of the cold that had turned the valley into a graveyard for 3 straight days, and he stood there a long moment before he spoke. "I was wrong," he said. "Just that. Nothing more. In that valley, from that man, it carried more weight than any speech could have." The knock came 4 nights later, past 10 o'clock, when Mara had already banked the fire and put Tam to bed. She opened the door to find Otis Kell standing in the snow with his wife and 2 children behind him, all of them white-faced with cold. Their own cabin's roof caved in under the weight of the storm's drifts. Otis was the same man who had laughed until he had to sit down, the same man who had coined the name Weed Wall and spread it up and down the valley. He didn't say the name now. He didn't say much of anything. He stood in the doorway with frost in his beard and his younger daughter asleep against his shoulder, and simply said, "We've nowhere else to go, Mrs. Voss." Mara stepped back and held the door open wider. "Then come in out of the cold," she said. And that was all. No speech. No mention of the laughter. She warmed milk for the children and gave up her own bed to Otis's wife without being asked, and stayed up past midnight feeding the stove so the room where the children slept never dropped below warm. Otis sat by the fire most of that night, unable to sleep, and at one point he looked at the wall behind him, the same wall he'd once called a garden of ghosts, and said quietly, almost to himself, "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Voss." Mara only handed him another blanket. "You owe me nothing, Otis," she said. "Just don't laugh at the next person who tries something you don't understand." It was the closest she ever came to a lesson, and she said it so gently it barely sounded like one. If there was any satisfaction in her at all that night, she kept it as quiet as she'd kept everything else. The viewer does the gloating. Mara Voss never did. By the following autumn, the wall wasn't a joke anymore. Hollis Dunmore built one on his own barn first, then on the church, testing every measurement Mara gave him and refining 2 of them further. Within 2 winters, half the cabins in Split Creek wore a ring of packed stalks against their walls, 32 inches thick at the base, vented low on the shaded side, tied in bundle courses, just the way Ezra Voss had once taught a 14-year-old girl in a Nebraska sod house nobody remembered anymore. Nobody called it the Weed Wall by the second winter. They called it the Voss Wall. And within 5 years, freight drivers were carrying the method north into Montana and south into Colorado, and most of the men building it had never once met the widow, whose grandfather's 4 sentences had started it all. Amos Ferry lived long enough to see 3 more winters pass through that valley, without the losses the Iron Silence storm had cost it, and he took to telling newcomers, half in jest and half in earnest reverence, that the valley had learned more about surviving winter from a widow's flower garden than from every almanac and old-timer's guess combined. The idea outlived the argument. That was the only ending Mara Voss ever seemed to want. Tam grew up watching his mother's ledger become the valley's textbook. Page after page of temperatures and cordwood and wall thicknesses passed hand to hand by men who had once laughed at his mother across a mercantile counter. He never once heard her bring up the laughter herself. She didn't need to. Every winter after that one did the reminding for her, plainly, in a language nobody in Split Creek ever mistook again. She never once stood in front of a crowd and reminded anyone who had laughed. She didn't need to. The wall did all of the reminding required, every winter, in a language the whole valley eventually learned to read. 38 below on one side of a wall of dead flowers, 61 above on the other, and no interpretation necessary at all. The strongest protection a person can build isn't always the one that looks strongest from the road. Sometimes it's the one everyone laughs at first. So here's the question this story leaves you with, and it's not a hard one, even if it's an honest one. If you'd been standing on that road in Split Creek in the autumn of 1886, watching a grieving widow haul dead sunflower stalks against her cabin walls while everyone around you laughed, would you have laughed along with them? Or would you have been one of the few willing to listen to what winter had already been trying to teach the whole valley, long before it arrived to prove it?